August 28th, 2008. Laurel, Maryland. While returning to her apartment after running errands, 28-year-old government employee Kanika Powell is shot to death inside the building's hallway. In the preceding days, Kanika claimed that separate men impersonating an FBI agent and a deliveryman had knocked on her apartment door, but she refused to let them inside. 2.5 months later, Sean Nicholas Green, a 31-year-old government employee from the same county, is shot to death by a masked gunman while parked in traffic. Due to the top-secret nature of their jobs, there is speculation that both murders might be connected, but the identities of the killers and the motive for these crimes remain unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering two cold cases that some people believe might be connected. The 2008 murders of Kanika Powell and Sean Nicholas Green. The Kanika Powell case was originally requested to me last year by Cecily Cooper, one of the previous winners of our Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, and after seeing an extensive post on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit last month, I decided now would finally be a good time to do an episode about it. Both of the subjects on today's episode were victims of the most frustrating type of cold case, the seemingly motiveless murder. Kanika Powell and Sean Nicholas Green both worked in top-secret positions for the government and lived seemingly ordinary lives before they were gunned down by an unknown assailant who left no evidence behind. What's particularly frightening about Kanika's story is that in the days prior to her murder, she had multiple men whom she did not recognize show up at her door and attempt to gain entry to her apartment, and one of them was posing as an FBI agent. At first glance, there doesn't seem to be anything in Kanika or Sean's backgrounds which would make them likely targets for murder, but given that they both work for the government, there are a lot of conspiracy theories about them possibly stumbling across something which put their lives in danger. It's still unclear if these two murders are actually connected, but regardless, I'm going to cover both of them on this episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off by examining the unsolved murder of Kanika Powell. Our story begins in 2008 in Laurel, Maryland, located in Prince George's County, approximately 40 minutes outside of Washington, D.C. Our central figure is 28-year-old Kanika Powell, who lives alone in her apartment complex. After graduating high school, Kanika decided to enlist in the Army and served a tour of duty in Korea before transitioning into a contract job at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, also known as APL. The lab serves as a technical resource for government agencies, and hundreds of homeland security and research projects take place there. Working at APL requires a top-secret security clearance, and after being employed there as a contractor for 2 years, Kanika was finally offered a full-time position in 2006. Of course, given the top-secret nature of her job, she never shared any specific details about what she did there, and seemed to be living a quiet, uneventful life. However, on August 25, 2008, Kanika would surprise her family and friends by sending them a mass email in which she described an unsettling incident she had recently experienced. 2 days earlier, on the evening of Saturday, August 23rd, Kanika claimed she heard a knock on her apartment door at around 7 p.m. When Kanika asked who it was, there was no answer, so she looked out the peephole and saw a man she did not recognize standing in the hallway. Once again, Kanika asked the man who he was, and he replied that he was with the FBI and looking for Kanika Powell. He held up an FBI shield to the peephole, but Kanika did not see a picture ID, and the man never revealed his name. He then said he was looking for Kanika in regards to an investigation, but Kanika had no idea what he was talking about and told him to show her a warrant or some sort of documentation. Instead of responding, the man just walked away, and Kanika said that she could hear another voice outside telling him to walk in the opposite direction. Kanika then looked out her bedroom window and saw the so-called FBI agent leave, though it doesn't sound like she saw anyone else. In her email, Kanika described the situation as scary and said she got no sleep for the rest of the weekend. She did call the FBI to check up on this, and they expressed their skepticism that this man was a real agent, because they would never go up to someone's door alone and would always leave behind a card so you could contact them. Kanika also mentioned contacting the police, who arrived within minutes and canvassed the entire apartment complex, but could not find the man she described. Kanika concluded her email with the lines, quote, "Pass this on, ladies. This is not a fake forward. This happened to me, Kanika. Who knows who these guys are and what they are doing and in what other areas other than mine." End quote. Anyway, Kanika immediately informed the management of her apartment complex about the situation and had a new security system installed at her place, but things would only get more unsettling. On the evening of August 27th, Kanika phoned up her mother, Judy Forrest, and told her that she had just received another knock at her apartment door from a man asking if she was Kanika Powell. When she looked out the peephole, Kanika saw another man she did not recognize, but he was not the same man who claimed to be an FBI agent. When Kanika would not open the door, the man said he had a package for her and needed to go get it, but he never returned, nor did he leave behind any note, which said where she could collect a package. Well, believe it or not, at around 7:30 a.m. the following morning, Kanika phoned up her mother again and said that another incident had just occurred where a man knocked on her door claiming to have a package for her. This really freaked Kanika out, as it seemed very unlikely that a real deliveryman would be delivering packages that early in the morning. Once again, Kanika refused to open the door and called the police to her apartment after the man left, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. Kanika told Judy that the incident with the FBI agent had initially made her suspect that she could have been a randomly selected victim of an attempted scam, but the two appearances from the so-called delivery man now made her believe she was specifically being targeted. Kanika then said that since she was planning to go out of town the following day, she had decided to take the day off from work. She had some errands to run, and now felt she needed to do them during the day so she could be back at her apartment before dark. Kanika ended the call, but unfortunately, tragedy would strike within the next 5 hours. Kanika went out and ran her errands as planned, but when she returned to her apartment at around 11:50 a.m., there was someone already waiting for her in the hallway. The perpetrator immediately opened fire and shot several bullets into Kanika's upper torso before fleeing the scene. Medical attention was immediately summoned to the apartment complex, and while Kanika was still alive when they arrived, she was in critical condition. She was quickly taken to the hospital, but never regained consciousness and died the following day. If there was one silver lining to this whole tragedy, it's that Kanika was an organ donor, so 2 other lives wound up being saved after they received her kidneys. When police initially arrived at the murder scene, they found Kanika's wallet and keys next to her body, which seemed to rule out robbery as being the motive. And herein lied the problem. No one could figure out what the motive for this crime may have been. Kanika had no known enemies, no spurned lovers from her past, no criminal history, and nothing illegal or suspicious was found inside her apartment. The only thing in Kanika's background which might have made her a potential target for murder was her government job at APL, which gave her access to classified information. A spokesman for APL made a public statement about Kanika's death, but said that due to the top-secret nature of her work, they could not identify Kanika's official job title with them or the lab she worked in. According to her mother, Judy, Kanika would sometimes leave town for a couple days at a time in order to pick up things for her lab, but of course, she was unable to reveal any specifics about where she was going and what exactly she was doing. Since investigators had virtually no evidence to work with, Kanika's death just left everyone completely perplexed until another baffling murder took place only 2.5 months later. On November 12th, 31-year-old Sean Nicholas Green climbed into his black Cadillac DeVille and left his apartment in Oxon Hill, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C. Sean was apparently on his way to the gym for a workout, but at 5:31 p.m., while he was stopped behind a row of cars at a red light, a masked gunman approached his vehicle and fired 9 shots through the driver's side window. Sean was shot in the head and killed instantly before the gunman fled the scene. While there were witnesses to the shooting, none of them got a good enough look at the perpetrator to provide a detailed description. Much like Kanika's case, there seemed to be no apparent motive for this crime. There was no robbery or any attempt at a carjacking, as the gunman never said anything to Sean or made an attempt to open the door. It wasn't long before connections started being made between the two murders. Like Kanika, Sean was single and lived alone, and for the previous 2 years, he'd been working a government job which required top-secret clearance. Sean was a contractor for BEA Systems and did information technology work as a computer specialist at the National Counterterrorism Center in McLean, Virginia. Both crimes took place in Prince George's County, and Oxon Hill is located only about 30 miles away from Laurel. But once again, there was nothing in Sean's background which would have made him a likely target for murder, as he had no criminal history, was considered a role model to his 8 nephews, and was known for being a religious man who could be seen reading the Bible during his breaks at work. Since another man who lived in Sean's apartment complex drove a similar-looking car to his, investigators speculated that Sean may have been the victim of mistaken identity, but it doesn't look like this lead ever went anywhere. And ultimately, they never found any evidence to suggest that Sean and Kanika's murders were connected, but the following year, the Prince George's County Police would arrest a man who turned out to be a serial killer and has been looked at as a potential suspect in Kanika's case. In July of 2009, 26-year-old Jason Thomas Scott was taken into custody after a sting operation in which he sold a stolen gun to an undercover informant from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Over the past few years, Scott had been responsible for dozens of burglaries and home invasions, but a search of his house would also turn up evidence that he had committed at least 5 murders. In July of 2008, 46-year-old Vilma Butler was shot to death by an intruder at her home in the town of Bowie before the house was set on fire. At the start of 2009, there would be 2 more horrific tragedies in the nearby town of Largo, which earned Scott the nickname the Mother-Daughter Killer. In January, 45-year-old Karen Lofton and her 16-year-old daughter Carissa were both shot to death inside their home. 2 months after that, 42-year-old Dolores DeWitt and her 20-year-old daughter Ebony were murdered inside their home before their bodies were placed inside a car which belonged to a neighbor, which was subsequently stolen, driven to the driveway of a vacant house, and set on fire. Scott became the prime suspect in all these murders, but he first went on trial for 11 other felonies, which included his many burglaries and sexually assaulting a 17-year-old girl in one of the houses he invaded, and he wound up receiving a 100-year sentence. In 2013, Scott decided to enter an Alford plea for the murders of Dolores and Ebony DeWitt, which meant he wasn't admitting guilt, but acknowledging that prosecutors had enough evidence to convict him. In exchange for the plea, Scott would not be charged with the other 3 murders and received an additional 85-year sentence. Anyway, given that all these crimes took place in Prince George's County during the same time period when Kanika was murdered, some people have wondered if perhaps Scott might have been her killer. While the MO for Kanika's murder was much different than Scott's other crimes, he did make the deliberate decision to change his MO when he killed the Loftons and the DeWitts. In fact, an FBI profiler who studied the murders of both families initially concluded that the crimes were not connected. Even though Scott committed the 5 murders alone, he did bring along 2 separate accomplices, Marcus Dormanalian Hunter and Terrence Alexander Cook, on some of his burglaries, and at least 2 men are believed to be involved in Kanika's death. But the most intriguing connection is the fact that Scott had a part-time job at the UPS facility in Landover and would use their database to gather information on his victims before breaking into their homes. And as you recall, the man believed to be Kanika's killer had attempted to enter her apartment by claiming he had a package for her. But regardless, no evidence has ever surfaced to link Jason Thomas Scott to this crime. For the past decade, the investigations into the murders of Kanika Powell and Sean Nicholas Green have pretty much hit a complete standstill, and both crimes continue to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So the circumstances behind both these deaths are absolutely terrifying, and Kanika's story in particular sounds like a scenario you would find in a fictional thriller. It's just so scary to think that someone could be living a seemingly ordinary, uneventful life before they are murdered in what appears to resemble a premeditated contract hit, and no one can figure out why the victim was targeted. I think one reason that Kanika's story really seems to strike a chord with people is that when she first became suspicious that something was wrong, and that the so-called FBI agent who visited her wasn't legitimate, she took the proper precautions and did all the things most safety-conscious people would do when confronted with the situation. She refused to open the door, immediately contacted the police, let her friends and family know what was going on, upgraded the security measures at her apartment, and changed up her routine so that she could run her errands before it got dark outside. But in spite of all this, it did not matter, as the perpetrator just seemed bound and determined to kill Kanika, so they somehow managed to find a way to do so. And unless Kanika was holding something back from the other people in her life, it sounds like she had no idea who the people at her door could have been, or why they would want to harm her. Since this is a very frightening story that many people can identify with, it's surprising that the case isn't more well known. As far as media coverage goes, the Washington Post ran an extensive article shortly after Kanika's murder, and it was featured on the TV show Crime Watch Daily years later, but other than that, there's very little information out there. But in recent years, it has become a heavily discussed case online, as there are a number of threads about it on Reddit, an extensive article at the True Noir Crime blog, and it's also been featured on the Trace Evidence podcast and in a number of YouTube series about unsolved cold cases. As far as Sean Nicholas Green's murder goes, there's even less media coverage out there. His case was featured in a couple of Washington Post articles following the murder, but the investigation quickly hit a brick wall, and the story completely faded from the spotlight. I'm sure most people might think that the reason these cases haven't got a lot of attention from the media is because both victims were African American, but to be fair, it really doesn't look like there's been anything to report on these past 10 years. Since Kanika's case and Sean's case are often linked together, you will find quite a bit of discussion about them on conspiracy theory message boards. Given that both victims had government jobs which required top-secret clearances and were murdered only 30 miles away from each other in the same county within a 2.5-month time frame, it's easy to understand why some people believe there's a connection. Both crimes resemble a professional hit from killers who left no evidence behind, so of course, some conspiracy theorists believe that both Kanika and Sean must have been involved in something at their government jobs, which put their lives in jeopardy. Well, whatever the individual motives for these crimes may have been, I really have my doubts that both victims were killed by the same people. Yes, Kanika and Sean worked government jobs which required top-secret clearances, but considering that Prince George's County borders Washington, D.C., you could say the same thing about a lot of people who live there. The fact of the matter is that they were employed by 2 completely different organizations, as Kanika worked for the Applied Physics Laboratory, while Sean did contract work for the National Counterterrorism Center, so I don't see why some team of covert assassins would need to eliminate these 2 particular people who worked at totally separate places. And the circumstances of how each crime went down are completely different. It seems like whoever murdered Kanika made multiple attempts to enter her apartment by posing as someone, whereas Sean's killer just brazenly walked up to his car and shot him, even though he was stopped in the middle of traffic on a public street with other witnesses around. So I think it's probably just a coincidence that two government employees with similar personal lives were murdered 30 miles apart in the same county within a 2.5-month window, but even if the crimes are not connected, they're both equally as baffling. Before I discuss Kanika's case, I'll start off by analyzing Sean's murder, since there really isn't a whole lot to talk about, unfortunately. I will say that both these cases are reminiscent of the 1994 murder of Matt Flores, a case I featured on the podcast last year. As you might recall, Matt was climbing out of his vehicle at his workplace parking lot when he was shot in the back of the head by an unknown perpetrator. Like Sean's murder, the crime took place in a public place with multiple witnesses around, but the killer managed to escape without anybody getting a good look at them. The crime had all the hallmarks of a professional hit, and since Matt had served in the Army prior to receiving an honorable discharge and starting a new civilian job, some people wondered if something during his military service might have prompted someone to kill him. But investigators could not find anything in Matt's background which made him a potential target for a professional assassination, so his death may have been a tragic case of mistaken identity. And I think the same logic might apply to Sean's murder. He just seemed like an ordinary guy with no known enemies who was living an uneventful life, so why would a masked gunman be so brazen as to approach his car in traffic and fire 9 shots into him? I believe there's a misconception that because Sean and Kanika both had top secret clearances, they automatically had access to privileged government information which put their lives at risk, but that's not necessarily the case. Getting a top secret clearance means that you will be granted access to a facility containing top secret information, but that doesn't mean you'll automatically be privy to everything going on there. For example, a custodian who works at one of these facilities can be granted a top secret clearance after they passed a background check, which shows they're not a national security risk. But just because they're allowed to clean a building containing classified information does not mean they're going to be uncovering government secrets while on the job. Sean was a contractor who did IT work at the National Counterterrorism Center, so while he had access to computers containing sensitive national security information, I don't get the impression that he was working directly on any projects related to counterterrorism. But could Sean have inadvertently come across something he wasn't supposed to see, which prompted someone to order a professional hit on him? That seems doubtful to me. I still think the most likely explanation for Sean's murder is that he was an innocent victim of mistaken identity. Since there was no attempt at a robbery or a carjacking, it seems like the only thing the killer cared about was eliminating the person driving that particular vehicle. I know the authorities said they were looking into another resident from Sean's apartment complex who drove a similar looking car to his, but they've never revealed if there was anything in that person's background which would have made them a target for murder. Sadly, I have a feeling that Sean was just a very decent person who was killed over something he had absolutely nothing to do with. If this was mistaken identity, I don't know what the intended victim could have done to prompt a masked killer to murder them while they were stopped at a red light, but whoever did this left no evidence behind, and it sounds like the authorities have been completely stumped for the past decade. But whatever the motive for this crime was, I don't believe it had anything to do with what happened to Kanika. Now, the circumstances of Kanika's murder are even stranger, and if she was killed by the same people who were knocking on her door, then you can immediately rule out the mistaken identity theory, since they specifically asked for Kanika Powell. And what adds to the strangeness of this crime is that there were apparently multiple people involved. When the person posing as the FBI agent showed up at her door, Kanika thought she heard another voice outside telling him to walk in the other direction. And she also established that the man who knocked on her door saying he had a package for her was a different person than the FBI agent. One thing which is particularly helpful about this case is the fact that the original email Kanika sent to her friends and family detailing her encounter with the FBI agent is available for viewing online, so you can read her own first-hand account of the incident. I think the one thing most everyone can agree on is that this guy was not a real FBI agent, which the FBI personally confirmed. A bad guy posing as someone from law enforcement in order to gain access to a victim's home is a trope you will sometimes see in works of fiction, but I don't know how often this situation happens in real life. Given Kanika's extensive experience in the military and the government, it's easy to understand why she was able to see through the whole thing and figure out it was a ruse. However, even though the ruse did not work, it doesn't look like it deterred the perpetrators, since there would be 2 more incidents of someone knocking at Kanika's door claiming to be a delivery man. It must be stated that since no one else witnessed Kanika's murder, and she never regained consciousness after she was shot, we cannot say with 100% certainty if the killer was the FBI agent or the delivery man, though it seems very likely it was one of them. But while Sean Nicholas Green could have been the random victim of a killer who was targeting someone else, whoever murdered Kanika was clearly targeting her and going the extra mile to ensure she was dead. It sounds like investigators couldn't find anything in Kanika's personal background which would make her the target of such a complicated murder plot. But since Kanika's professional background was shrouded in secrecy, it's easy to assume she was murdered over something related to her job. You could also make another comparison to the Matt Flores case, as both victims had previously served in the Army, but the key difference is that Matt had just received an honorable discharge in the weeks prior to his murder, whereas Kanika hadn't served in 4 years, so it seems less likely her murder was related to something from her time in the military. One of the main things which makes this case so difficult to analyze is that specific details about Kanika's job with APL have been kept under wraps from the public, and since Kanika couldn't reveal much about her work with her family or friends, they have no idea if it could have played any role in her death. I know that Kanika's mother has speculated about the work trips Kanika made, which required her to be out of town for days. They may not have any significance at all to this case, but since APL is not allowed to share any details, one can't help but wonder if Kanika was working on some sort of top-secret project which ultimately put her life at risk. I just mentioned that the full email that Kanika sent about her encounter with the FBI is available for viewing online, and some people have picked up on the fact that it was signed Kanika T. Powell, Special Security. This has made some online sleuths speculate that Kanika worked in the Special Security Office at APL, a job which would involve receiving and disseminating sensitive compartmented information and special access programs throughout the government and the military. It's a job that certainly would have allowed Kanika to access and handle classified information, though it sounds like the work would have been more administrative in nature and not something which would make her the target of an elaborate murder plot. However, even though APL could not disclose details about Kanika's job to the public, I'd like to think they would have disclosed it to the authorities who were investigating her murder. If investigators turned up anything in Kanika's professional background which raised red flags, I would hope they followed up on it, but if they did find something, they may not have disclosed it publicly for national security reasons. The crime itself is a weird contradiction, as some parts of it seem to resemble a professional hit, while others seem pretty sloppy. The first incident with the FBI agent knocking at the door took place on August 23rd, but Kanika was not murdered until August 28th, because her killer was apparently waiting for her in the building's hallway as she returned to her apartment from running errands. So this begs the question, why didn't the killer just do this to begin with? I have to assume that Kanika left her apartment at other points during this 5-day period, so if someone wanted to kill her that badly, why go through the charade of trying to access her apartment by posing as a delivery man? After the FBI agent ruse failed, why not just wait outside Kanika's apartment and kill her after she leaves? I guess the issue is that they might run the risk of being seen by other witnesses if they hung around Kanika's building for a while, but that is how they ultimately wound up killing her anyway. The ruse of telling Kanika that they had a package for her just seems very poorly planned, as it sounds like this delivery man wasn't even carrying anything when Kanika looked at him through the peephole. Why not at least carry some sort of box with you to make the charade more convincing, rather than say, "Oh, I need to go get it"? What's particularly strange is that Kanika was originally planning to go to work on the day she was murdered, but changed her mind after the unsettling incident with the delivery man occurred earlier that morning, so she decided to take the day off and run errands. Yet the killer was waiting in the hallway to shoot her when she arrived home at 11:50 a.m. If they were familiar with her routine, they should have known that she ordinarily wouldn't arrive home from work until much later that day. They had no reason to be hanging around the hallway at that time of the morning, so this suggests that someone might have been watching and following Kanika when she originally left her apartment and decided to make their move when she returned. It's possible that the killer's original plan was to force their way into Kanika's apartment, possibly to sexually assault her, which is why they went through the ruse of pretending to be someone else. But once it became apparent that she wasn't going to open the door for them, they changed their strategy and decided to wait for her to leave before they killed her. This is my biggest issue with the theory that this was some sort of professional contract hit. If they originally showed up at her apartment with the intention of killing her on August 23rd, why wait 5 more days before implementing a new plan? Now, from her communications with her family and friends, it sounds like Kanika didn't have any idea who would want to harm her, and if she had suspects in mind, she never said anything. Kanika also never gave off the impression that she believed the harassment was connected to her job, but I guess the complicating factor is that if she became involved with something top secret, which put her life at risk, would she have been able to share that with anyone? Thus far, the one person mentioned as a possible suspect is Jason Thomas Scott, but it must be clarified that law enforcement has never mentioned his name in conjunction with the investigation. Scott's possible involvement is just a theory which has been tossed around by online sleuths, and there are legitimate reasons to believe he might be the killer. All of his known murders took place during the same time period Kanika was killed, and occurred in Largo and Bowie, 2 towns in Prince George's County, which are both around 20 to 30 minutes away from Laurel. Scott also worked at the UPS facility in Landover, which is also only about 25 minutes away from where Kanika lived, and he used their database to gather information on his victims. This detail is particularly compelling, since a man showed up at Kanika's door claiming to have a package for her. I know that Kanika's murder plot seemed to involve at least 2 different men, but since Scott had 2 separate accomplices on some of his burglaries, Marcus Dormalian Hunter and Terrence Alexander Cook, it's not completely implausible that he could have brought either of them along to assist him. And even though Scott had already been sentenced to 100 years in prison for his burglaries, he still decided to take an Alford plea rather than go on trial for murder. Technically, he has never admitted guilt in any of the murders he committed, so if he also killed Kanika, I doubt he'll confess to it anytime soon. Of course, the MO in Kanika's case was a lot different than the rest of Scott's murders, but remember, he deliberately changed his MO in between the murders of the Loftons and the DeWitts, and managed to fool an FBI profiler. But I don't know, Kanika's murder just seems so much different than every other crime Scott committed. Throughout his life, Scott literally broke into dozens of homes, and there's no indication that he ever attempted to go through a ruse where he knocked on a victim's door and impersonated someone else. If Scott really wanted access to Kanika's apartment, he probably could have just broken in, rather than going through that whole charade. And there's also the fact that Kanika's wallet was left right next to her body, ruling out robbery as a motive. Given that Scott was a career burglar, I'm not sure he would have fled the scene without taking the wallet with him. While I can't say with 100% certainty that Scott wasn't the perpetrator, it just seems to me that whoever murdered Kanika had some sort of personal vendetta against her, and thus far, no connection has ever been made between the two of them. Ultimately, the part which makes it very difficult for me to come to a definitive conclusion about this case is the fact that the murder seemed to involve more than one person. I know there have been a lot of different interpretations over Kanika hearing a voice in the hallway telling the FBI agent to walk in the other direction. This could have been an accomplice, but some have speculated that it may have been another tenant at the apartment complex who saw the FBI agent walking in the wrong direction and decided to correct him. But if it was a tenant, why wouldn't they have come forward after Kanika's murder in order to clarify this? Kanika did make it clear that the FBI agent and the person who came to her door to deliver a package were completely different people, though it's not so clear if both the incidents with the package involved the same person. What's also not clear is if Kanika ever provided a description of any of these individuals when she contacted the police. If she did, It must have been pretty vague, because no specific details about these men have ever been released to the public. It's worth noting that Jason Thomas Scott is African American, but we don't even know the race of the two men Kanika saw, so I have no idea if that means he can be ruled out as a suspect or not. I am inclined to believe there were two people waiting in the hallway when the FBI agent showed up at the door, but when that ruse didn't work, they decided to change their strategy and have the second person show up a few days later pretending to be a deliveryman. But if that's what really happened, why would two separate people have a motive to murder Kanika? It would be one thing if Kanika had a stalker with some sort of unhealthy obsession with her, which escalated into murder, but two of them? Remember, no one actually witnessed the murder take place, so for all we know, there could have been two killers at the scene when Kanika was shot. Man, I really don't know what to think of this one. Overall, I do lean towards the most logical explanation being that Kanika was killed by someone with a personal grudge against her, but part of me still wonders if Kanika's murder really was connected to her job somehow. Whatever the motive, it seems to me that Kanika genuinely had no idea who might have been behind this, as the episode with the FBI agent initially made her believe she was the randomly targeted victim of some sort of scam. But when people kept coming back to her apartment, she started to think that someone was after her. It's possible she did stumble onto some incriminating information at her job, which put her life at risk without even realizing it. However, that seems like the type of scenario you'd expect to find in some fictional thriller, and I think that if someone really wanted Kanika dead because she knew something, they would have found a way to kill her the first night they visited her apartment on August 23rd. This is definitely one of the more frightening cold cases I've covered on this podcast, not only because Kanika was killed, but because she had to spend the last few days of her life living in fear and seemed unaware of who might be after her. Because of all the secrecy surrounding Kanika's job, I do wonder if investigators know more than they're letting on and can't reveal it publicly, or if they're just as baffled as everyone else. I know some conspiracy theorists think that the reason Kanika's death hasn't gotten a lot of coverage this past decade is because secret forces in the government are trying to keep her story out of circulation, but I don't think that's the case. I believe the reason it might have remained in relative obscurity is because there just haven't been any tangible leads in the case at all since the murder happened. But because it's been featured on numerous podcasts, YouTube series, and online discussions, interest in the case has increased in recent years, and hopefully, this might one day lead to the truth about what happened coming to light. A reward of $25,000 is being offered, so if you happen to have any information on the unsolved murders of Kanika Powell or Sean Nicholas Green, please contact Prince George's County Crime Solvers at 1-866-411-TIPS. That's 1-866-411-8477. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've already released some exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and we'll be releasing another new one this month, so to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take this moment to give shoutouts to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Chow L, Matt H, Sarah, Angie S, and Steph O. And I've recently been giving shoutouts to our patrons who have been signed up with us for a long time, and I've been doing so in increments of 20. So this week, I'd like to thank Dirthy, Ray K, Dre L, Mick, Catherine B, Cynthia O, Judy B, Dee Dee Shirley J, Ethan S, Sarah G, Lynn B, Rachel O, Cara D, John T, Gail R, Jason C, Jennifer B, Christina S, Brooke, and Pat A. A huge thanks again to everyone for their support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I'd like to play a promo for a podcast about cults titled Let's Talk About Sex. In fact, just this week, they released a new episode in which yours truly made a voice cameo as a real-life person who escaped from a cult. So be sure to check it out.
I'm Sarah Steele, and I host a podcast called Let's Talk About Sects. I look at a different cult each episode, examining the group's leadership, beliefs, recruitment methods, member experiences, and any notable incidents during its existence. It's a monthly podcast with a heavily researched, deep dive storytelling style. That's Let's Talk About Sects, and the website is ltaspod.com for all your podcast provider links. Hope you'll have a listen.
I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, which has a number of interesting threads about these cases. Need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.